The first officer noticed the smell before he noticed anything else. It lingered beneath the carport, faint, unpleasant, impossible to identify with certainty. In a mountain community surrounded by dense forest and wildlife, strange odors weren't unusual. After a brief pause, he continued searching the property, unaware that the source of the smell was only a few feet away. Months later, investigators would realize they had unknowingly stood beside the answer they had been looking for. But on that afternoon, they left believing the house was simply empty. The property belonged to 60-year-old Craig Thatford, a successful roofing contractor who lived there with his wife, Dina, in the quiet mountain village of Cloudcroft, New Mexico. Friends described Craig as dependable to the point of predictability. If someone called, he answered. If he missed a call, he returned it. Long stretches of silence simply weren't part of his character. That was why one phone call to the sheriff's office quickly turned into something investigators couldn't ignore. A longtime friend explained that no one had heard from Craig in nearly 2 months. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. Even more concerning, no one could reach Dina either. At first, deputies considered ordinary explanations. Couples traveled, people relocated. Sometimes families lost touch for a while. Still, something about this request felt different. Deputies drove to the wooded property to conduct a welfare check. The house appeared almost frozen in time. Lights were still on inside. Through the windows, furniture remained exactly where it should be. Several packed boxes hinted that someone might have been preparing for a move, but there were no vehicles coming or going, no voices, no movement behind the glass. Repeated knocks echoed through the quiet property. No response. As deputies circled the buildings, security cameras overlooked the driveway. Everything seemed intact, yet strangely abandoned. Then one officer slowed near the detached carport. "What's that smell?" The question hung in the air for only a moment. Without obvious signs of forced entry or visible evidence of violence, there was little reason to push further. The deputies documented the visit and left believing Craig and Dina had likely moved without telling everyone close to them. For a brief moment, the mystery seemed disappointingly ordinary. Then less than 24 hours later, another call reached the sheriff's office. This time it wasn't a friend. It was Craig's grandson. And his version of events quietly dismantled everything investigators thought they understood. The second call changed the investigation before a single new piece of evidence was found. Craig's grandson wasn't calling because his grandfather had been gone for a few weeks. According to him, no one in the family had seen or spoken to Craig in more than 4 months. That timeline immediately conflicted with what deputies had been told the day before, and it came with another unsettling detail. The only person claiming to have regular contact with Craig was his wife, Dina. Her explanation sounded simple enough. She told relatives that Craig had left for Mexico after their marriage fell apart. He had supposedly met another woman, filed for divorce, and wanted nothing more to do with his old life. His grandson didn't believe a word of it. Craig loved his family. Even if his marriage had ended, disappearing without a single conversation felt completely out of character. This time, deputies returned to the property with a different objective. Instead of focusing only on the house, they widened their search to the people who knew the couple best. One nearby neighbor admitted he hadn't seen Craig since January. They had served together as volunteer firefighters and spoke regularly. Then, without warning, the communication stopped. He couldn't explain it, only that the silence felt wrong. Another neighbor offered a completely different version of events. She believed Craig had traveled to Texas to care for his elderly mother. She also considered Dina a friend and said the couple was separating, but even she admitted she hadn't seen Craig herself. Everything she knew had come through Dina. Now investigators had 3 different stories. Mexico, Texas, or simply nowhere. The contradictions weren't proof of a crime. Families often misunderstood situations, especially during difficult divorces, but every interview seemed to move the truth further away instead of bringing it into focus. Deputies decided there was only one person who could clarify the confusion. They called Dina. She answered almost immediately. Her voice remained calm. She confirmed the marriage was ending and repeated that Craig had left for Mexico with another woman. She even described seeing him pack his belongings before he left. To her, there was nothing mysterious about his disappearance. Yet something subtle caught the deputy's attention. Her answers sounded polished, not rehearsed exactly, but unusually complete. Before he had finished asking one question, she often seemed ready for the next, as though she had already anticipated where the conversation would go. On its own, that meant very little. People under stress often over-explain. But investigators couldn't ignore another growing problem. Every version of Craig's disappearance depended on one person, and no one besides Dina could verify any of it. The investigation was still officially a missing person case. But behind the scenes, detectives were about to hear from people who knew Dina long before Craig ever disappeared. What they revealed would transform quiet concern into genuine suspicion. Until this point, detectives were still trying to determine whether Craig Thatford had chosen to disappear. The next round of interviews made that possibility feel increasingly difficult to defend. As investigators dug deeper into Dina's past, one fact immediately stood out. Craig wasn't her first husband. He was her fourth. That alone meant nothing, but detectives wanted to understand whether previous relationships revealed a pattern or simply reflected an unhappy personal history. So they began making phone calls. The conversations were unsettling, not because every former husband told the same story, but because they described remarkably similar behavior. Several spoke about explosive arguments fueled by alcohol. Others recalled moments when ordinary disagreements escalated into frightening confrontations. One man described surviving incidents he believed could have turned deadly. Another remembered hearing Dina say something he had never forgotten, that if she could kill Craig and avoid the consequences, she would. It was an extraordinary allegation. But detectives knew allegations weren't evidence. People often speak bitterly after failed marriages, and investigators refused to build a case on resentment alone. Still, the interviews raised enough concern to widen the investigation. The focus soon shifted to someone who had lived inside the home much more recently, Dina's daughter. Unlike the former spouses, she wasn't recalling events from decades earlier. She described a household where arguments felt routine and tension never fully disappeared. She claimed her mother could become unpredictable, especially while drinking, and believed Craig had spent years trying to keep the peace rather than escalate conflict. Then she offered something detectives hadn't expected. She wondered whether her mother had been quietly interfering with Craig's medication long before he vanished. There was no evidence to support that suspicion, but it revealed how deeply fractured the family had become. As investigators sorted through those interviews, another discovery quietly shifted their attention in a different direction. Craig had disappeared months earlier, yet his financial life hadn't. Records showed large sums of money moving after he was last seen. Purchases included expensive assets and significant spending that appeared completely inconsistent with someone who had supposedly walked away to begin a new life in another country. Individually, none of these discoveries proved homicide. Together, they painted a picture that detectives could no longer ignore. The investigation was no longer centered on finding a missing man. It was becoming an effort to determine whether someone had been carefully creating the illusion that Craig was still alive. And when deputies learned Dina had quietly returned to the house, investigators saw an opportunity they couldn't afford to miss. What they didn't realize was that the next conversation would produce one of the most revealing performances in the entire case. When deputies returned to the property, Dina welcomed them inside without hesitation. It wasn't the reaction investigators typically expected from someone at the center of a growing missing person investigation. She appeared composed, conversational, even eager to explain what had happened. If anything, she seemed convinced that another conversation would finally put everyone's concerns to rest. The deputy allowed her to speak. Sometimes people reveal more when they don't feel interrupted. Dina repeated that she and Craig had separated months earlier. According to her, he had gone to help his mother before eventually leaving for Mexico. She insisted she had no reason to question his story at the time. Then, almost without prompting, she introduced something she believed supported her account: a handwritten note. She explained that after Craig supposedly stopped speaking with her directly, they communicated through messages left around the house. One note mentioned El Salto, Mexico, a destination Craig had reportedly visited before on fishing trips. At first glance, it seemed helpful, but the deputy noticed something difficult to explain. Dina relied heavily on the note to answer questions about Craig's whereabouts, yet she couldn't clearly remember when she had last seen him in person. Dates became vague, timelines blurred, details that should have been easy to recall seemed strangely uncertain, while other parts of her story remained unusually precise. The imbalance was subtle, but experienced investigators pay close attention to subtle things. Moments later, Dina volunteered another piece of information that no one had asked for. She claimed Craig kept approximately $1.5 million in cash inside two large safes in the basement. She also insisted she couldn't open them because she didn't know the combinations, a precaution Craig supposedly adopted after problems in a previous marriage. The deputy asked if he could see them. As they walked downstairs together, Dina appeared relaxed, casually describing the house as though nothing significant had happened there. The basement looked orderly. The safes stood exactly where she said they would. Yet the conversation itself had quietly shifted. Money had entered the investigation. If Craig truly disappeared voluntarily, why leave behind such a fortune? If the money was gone, who had accessed it? And if it was still there, why hadn't Craig returned for it? Before leaving, the deputy casually mentioned something about himself. Most of his career had been spent investigating homicides. The words landed with unexpected weight. For the first time that afternoon, Dina's confident rhythm seemed to falter. After the interview, the deputy chose not to drive away immediately. Instead, he continued speaking with neighbors who knew the couple well. What they shared dismantled two of Dina's most important claims. One neighbor insisted Craig had personally told him that Dina did know the safe combinations, directly contradicting what she had just told investigators. Another recalled a conversation from years earlier that had never stopped bothering him. He remembered Dina saying that if something ever happened to Craig, she wouldn't necessarily be unhappy about it. Those remarks still weren't proof of murder. But when investigators combined them with the conflicting timelines, the unexplained financial activity, the inconsistent stories, and Craig's complete silence, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to avoid. They weren't just searching for a missing man anymore. They were running out of reasons to believe he had ever left that property alive. Investigators finally reached a point where waiting carried more risk than acting. Craig was still missing. Dina had stopped answering calls. Rumors suggested she was considering leaving the country, while others claimed she had become increasingly despondent. Detectives knew that if she disappeared before they uncovered the truth, they might never find Craig or prove what had happened to him. A search warrant was approved. As officers moved through the house, they searched every room with one question in mind. If Craig had been killed here, what had been overlooked? The home appeared unusually clean. Investigators noticed multiple bottles of bleach, sections of the surveillance system that no longer functioned, and areas that seemed to have been carefully scrubbed. In one outbuilding, they documented what appeared to be bloodstaining near woodworking equipment. None of it was enough to explain Craig's disappearance, but together it suggested that someone had worked hard to erase a story the house once held. Meanwhile, a locksmith opened the basement safes. The deputy remembered Dina describing nearly $1.5 million hidden inside. Instead, investigators found only a fraction of that amount. The missing money didn't answer their questions. It created another one. Where had it gone? As detectives continued processing the property, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A call came in from Dina's daughter. This time, she wasn't sharing concerns or suspicions. She described what her mother had allegedly confessed. According to her account, Craig had been shot after a confrontation inside the house. His body had remained there before eventually being wrapped, moved with a tractor, and concealed beneath a detached carport. She even suggested where investigators should look. It was specific, painfully specific. Within minutes, search teams shifted their attention. Beneath a pile of boxes, rugs, and stored materials, they uncovered black plastic sheeting. Hidden underneath were human remains. Fingerprint identification confirmed what Craig's family had feared for months. The man everyone believed had traveled to Mexico had never left the property. The smell deputies noticed during their very first visit hadn't come from wildlife or the surrounding forest. It had been Craig. The autopsy determined he had suffered multiple gunshot wounds, including a fatal wound through the heart. Medical findings were consistent with him having died months earlier, around the time his family first lost contact. With Craig finally found, the investigation changed overnight. Dina was located at a hospital in Texas and taken into custody without incident. During questioning, detectives hoped to learn why Craig had been killed and what had happened inside the house that day. Instead, after confirming she understood the charges against her, Dina requested an attorney. The interview ended almost as soon as it began. Without a confession, prosecutors relied on the evidence they had spent months assembling, conflicting explanations, financial activity after Craig's disappearance, witness statements, forensic findings, and the concealment of his body. Dina was charged with first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. As of the latest public proceedings, she has maintained her innocence, and the case remains subject to the judicial process until a final verdict is reached. For Craig's family, however, one painful uncertainty had finally ended. They no longer had to wonder where he was. Yet another question may never be answered completely. What happened during those final moments inside that house? Only two people truly knew. One of them was buried beneath a carport for months. The other chose silence. And in many investigations, silence becomes the final piece of evidence that no detective can ever fully explain.